Welcome to Inflammatory Talk. You're with Jewish Producer. Tonight's episode of Inflammatory Talk is a special interview with Scott Eyman, the author of John Wayne, The Life and Legend. He wrote this book and it was released in April of this year. And our good friends over at Simon & Schuster were able to help pin Mr. Eyman down and arranged for us to meet for an interview. So thank you, Simon & Schuster, and thank you, Scott Eyman, for this incredible interview with Mr. Midnight Movie. It's a great 1 hour walk through just a bunch of information about John Wayne that you've probably never heard before. Scott Eyman has written the best book about John Wayne ever written. I'm just going to throw that out there. There's nothing out there that's better. It's a huge book. I've only seen it in hardcover. It might be in softcover, but check it out. You can find it at all the normal sources, Amazon and Barnes & Noble, all the biggies. And I'm really happy to have seen it at a lot of independent bookstores in my town. Congratulations to Scott Eyman for such a great effort. Thank you again for joining Inflammatory Talk. Enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, let us know. We're going to keep going. We're going to get more and more interviews like this one, and hopefully we'll get better at our craft. And we're very happy to have you along for the ride, so thanks again for listening. Enjoy. Here we go. All right, so we are going to give Mr. Scott Eyman a phone call.
All right.
Do you want to try an introduction before we call him?
We can do that later, can't we? John Wayne, The Life and Legend.
All right, here we go.
Hello.
Hey, Scott.
I'll make sure
Cool.
you both get a link to the...
Okay, great. Okay, let me go get my lemonade, and then we can sit down and do it.
Will do.
Okay, anytime you're ready.
But tonight, author of John Wayne, The Life and Legend. Scott Eyman, why don't you maybe perhaps introduce yourself and tell us your personal relationship with John Wayne, because you met him a few times.
Well, it was many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea. I was a kid. I was 21 years old. It was 1972, the summer, August. And I was kind of circling around the idea of being a writer, writing about the movies. And I figured that if I was going to write about the movies, I should probably talk to people who actually made the movies. So I started writing letters. And one of the letters I wrote was to John Wayne. I didn't lack for hubris. Surprisingly enough, he wrote me back, or rather his secretary wrote me back and said, if you're ever out here in L.A., I'll see what I can do to hook you up. I was just living in Ohio at the time where I was born and raised. And a few other people answered me back, so I kind of decided to start making plans to go to California for the first time. So about 8 weeks later, I arrived in Los Angeles, and I called Wayne's secretary, a sainted woman by the name of Mary St. John. And she said, oh, yeah, I remember your letter. She said, well, he's shooting a TV show at CBS on Thursday. She said, could you go over there about 1 o'clock? And I said, sure. So I didn't have enough money to rent a car, so I took a cab over to CBS and got dropped off and was ushered into his dressing room and sat with him for 90 minutes talking, mostly about the movies. I didn't ask him about cancer, and I didn't ask him about politics. At that time, he was America's most famous conservative, certainly most famous conservative in show business. Also, America's most famous cancer survivor. So we just talked. We talked about movies, all aspects of the movies, from John Ford and Howard Hawks to making B-westerns in the 30s and serials in the 30s, and all they had to do to turn Duke Morrison into John Wayne.
And I did notice,
and that's it basically.
We did get a copy of your new book that came out in April, John Wayne, The Life and Legend, and I also noticed that it appears that you did take a pretty nice picture of him. That's included in the middle of the book there in the binding. There's a photo credited to you.
Yep. Took it in his dressing room before he went out on stage. He was shooting it was a TV show for CBS, CBS's tribute to CBS for their 50-year anniversary. All the people, all Olivia Ball and Jack Benny and Bob Hope and Milton Berle and, everybody. So, and John Wayne, although he never worked for CBS, but now why stand on ceremony? So when it was time to shoot, finally, he went out. He said, well, come on with me. And, I watched him work, and he had me shoot some pictures on the stage with him and Milton Berle and him and Bob Hope and all that. And the people at CBS were very uptight because they didn't know who I was. I wasn't in the union. I wasn't working on the show. I was clearly associated with John Wayne in some vague way, and they didn't want to mess with John Wayne, so they let me shoot. And that shot I took in the dressing room was just before we went out on stage.
What was John Wayne's childhood like?
Oh, it was difficult. They were lower middle class on their best day, poor on their worst. His father was a pharmacist's assistant. He was a nice guy. The marriage was a bad marriage. They didn't get along at all. It was 2 out of 3 falls basically from the wedding day, and they were miserable together. And the kids weren't very happy either. There were 2 kids who became John Wayne, and his brother Bob. The father had trouble supporting the family. I mean, they moved around a lot. Marion was born in Winterset, Iowa, in 1907. They were there for 3 years. Then they moved to Earlham, which is down the road, about an hour and a half. They were there for a couple of years. They finally left Iowa when he was about 7 and moved to California, the desert. That was predictably a disaster. So then they moved to Glendale, California, which is actually when Marion Morrison became Duke Morrison, and where he began to come out of his shell of adolescent unhappiness. And by the time he graduated high school, Glendale High School, he was an all-state on the football team. He was president of the senior class. He was in the drama club. He was in the debating club. He was a big man on campus, basically. Until that point, it was a very difficult, very hand-to-mouth existence.
What was his relationship like with his brother?
His brother was a couple of years younger than he was. They were friendly. Wayne was the older brother, so he always took care of Bob. Bob was a nice guy. Bob lettered in football at USC, but Bob had zero ambition. So as is common with relatives of big movie stars, they're taken care of. They get jobs on the payroll, answering fan mail and things like that, basically just to keep them out of harm's way. And Wayne put his brother on the payroll on his production company as production manager, various and sundry, essentially meaningless jobs, to pay him a salary and keep a roof over his head. But Bob was basically a lifeguard. That's what he did, after he graduated from USC. He was a lifeguard. So he was not on fire with talent or ambition.
Sound like he had the better deal. He didn't have to deal with all the fans and being famous, and yet he got
in Hollywood.
And he got basically got taken care of.
Yeah, exactly. It's not uncommon. That sort of thing happens even now in the business. Somebody becomes a big star, and they have to take care of 1 or 2 or 3, more or less useless relatives who are sponging, essentially. And Bob was a nice guy. Everybody liked him, but nobody took him particularly seriously.
John Wayne's first film was The Big Trail, and now I believe that was the first 75 millimeter film.
70 mil. It was the first. Well, it wasn't the first 70 millimeter film. The industry had played with 70 millimeter earlier in the silent era, but it was the first concerted attempt by the industry to turn 70 millimeter into an industry standard. It was extremely expensive. It was made almost entirely on location in Wyoming, Montana, the West, and the process was, moving sound equipment and the heavy 70 millimeter cameras is extremely difficult. So they decided to put the money on the screen and not pay it to actors. They wanted young, unknown actors that they didn't have to pay any money to speak of. So Wayne was working as a prop guy at Fox, which was the studio that was making The Big Trail. And Raoul Walsh, the director of the film, saw him walking across the lot carrying a table and smiling and talking to a friend as he was doing it. And Wayne was 6'4" at this point. At this point, he's still Duke Morrison, but he was 6'4" and 180 pounds, 185 pounds, long hair, very handsome, great smile, and obviously strong as a bull. And he thought, the kid was gorgeous. So he knew the kid was working for John Ford. Wayne and John Ford were already good friends at this point. So he asked Ford what he thought, and Ford thought, well, maybe. So they did a screen test, and he photographed. Not everybody that looks good to the eye necessarily looks good to the camera lens, but Wayne did. So he got the job, even though he'd never had any acting training to speak of other than working in doing school plays in high school. He had camera presence from the very beginning, and the film cost $2 million in 1930 dollars, which is a huge amount of money, and it lost $1 million in 1930 money, which was a huge amount of money. And they Fox had thought that Wayne was going to be Tom Mix. He was going to be their big Western star, their big outdoor action hero, and they'd already lined up some Westerns for him to do after the big trail. But the film went down in flames, mainly because nobody showed the film in 70 millimeter. The industry had just spent, millions and millions of dollars retooling for sound a few years earlier, which required a huge capital investment, and they had absolutely zero interest in retooling for yet another production process, exhibition. So Wayne was basically back where he'd started, kind of out on his ass, because they'd rolled the dice with him, and it hadn't worked, and they decided to cut their losses. They'd only pay him $75 a week to make the movie, but they could have, they decided to save the $75.
And then he started making really grade Z, what they would call the Poverty Row pictures.
Right.
And
well, he took what work he could get at this point. He didn't want to go back to being behind the camera. He liked acting. He liked working in front of the camera, and he wanted to be. Also, even $75 a week was more money than he'd ever made in his life. Even if that's all he could make. So he was determined to stay in front of the camera. So he took what he could get. He took big parts in small movies and small parts in big movies. He starred in cheap serials, 12 to 15 chapter serials. He did B-Westerns, dozens and dozens of B-Westerns that took 5 days to shoot, the titles of which all blended together and which he could never keep straight in his own mind because they were made so quickly. And it was kind of demeaning to him. It wasn't something he enjoyed doing, but he did love making movies. He loved the familial aspect of it. He loved the camaraderie. And, even if he wasn't making great money, he was making good money. And then a couple of years after that, he was married, and kids started arriving. He had 4 kids in short order. So at that point, when that started happening, it wasn't a matter of choice. It was a matter of necessity.
Yeah. Now, well, we'll get into the relationship with his kids. I mean, my father, Ross, has the last interview, I believe, with Michael Wayne, who had died not just before he passed away.
Yeah, Mike died about 10 years ago. Yeah.
And my father he actually talked about the Culver Hotel, which we'll get into. And then he made the film that kind of broke him out of the mold, John Ford.
Stagecoach, right. Yeah,
Yes.
That came 9 long years after the betrayal. That's how long it took him to get a second chance, the brass ring on the merry-go-round. In those 9 years, like I said, he did dozens and dozens of B-Westerns and some serials and, whatever was on offer. And then finally John Ford offered him a part in a John Ford movie, which he'd kind of been hoping would happen because he and Ford he'd been part of Ford's social circle for 10 years at this point, since he'd been a prop boy at Fox. And they would go play cards together, and he'd go out on Ford's boat, and they would drink together. And they were cronies. They were buddies. Ford was a father figure to him. And Ford, all during the 30s, said, don't worry, you'll get your chance, and the fact is, Ford wasn't making Westerns at this point. And Wayne was particularly well suited to Westerns. Ford was making pictures like The Informer and The Hurricane and Aerosmith and all sorts of pictures that didn't really have parts for John Wayne in them. But he finally circled around to this Stagecoach property, which he had bought himself, and the studios were happy to do it if he'd get Gary Cooper or Marlene Dietrich or some big stars to do it. And he wouldn't do it. This was going to be Duke Wayne's big break. And he refused to do it with anybody but Duke Wayne, which everybody felt that Wayne was damaged goods, that he'd spent 10 years making B-westerns, cheap B-westerns, and nobody would pay to see John Wayne in an A picture. And John Ford only made A pictures. But Ford insisted, and Ford persisted, and got $500,000 to make the picture, a little less than $500,000 actually, to make the picture from Walter Wanger, who was an independent producer, and shot it with Wayne and Claire Trevor and Thomas Mitchell and a slew of great character actors like John Carradine. And it was a smash hit. And suddenly, Wayne was the movie star that he was supposed to have been in 1930, but hadn't been. But Stagecoach did, in fact, make him a star.
That's true, but he wasn't number one because he actually even played a villain in, I believe, the Reap the Wild Wind, if I'm not mistaken.
That was a couple of years later for DeMille, right? But see, to play even a heavy for Cecil B. DeMille was a huge deal, because DeMille's pictures were wildly expensive. They were heavily promoted. Everybody went to see them. And that introduced Wayne to an audience that really hadn't even seen Stagecoach. Even though Stagecoach was a hit, it was not a hit in the sense that a DeMille extravaganza was a hit. So that was actually a smart choice, even though he's not playing a very sympathetic part. Yeah. Oh, they got along great. They're political. They're political.
Oh, they were both politically the same. I'm sorry, they were both politically.
They were both politically conservative, and DeMille respected him because before Stagecoach, Wayne had tried to get a part in DeMille picture, and DeMille had kind of blown him off, because he was making cheap B-westerns. And after Stagecoach, when DeMille came back to him to hire him for Reap the Wild Wind, Wayne turned him down. And explained why he turned him down. Because DeMille had been a little sniffy about the possibility of hiring him for a previous picture. And DeMille kind of respected that he had the backbone to stand up to him and tell him that, he thought he'd been petty and small. So, actually, they respected each other.
Did he and Ray Milland get along?
Yeah, they got along fine. In fact, they were very friendly. They had the same agent for some time. And Wayne's second wife had been Milland's girlfriend, Chata, who was a Mexican actress, quote unquote. And Wayne met her when he and Milland, went on a Mexican vacation together with a couple other guys. They shared an agent, and they had a lot in common.
Now, when the war came, John Wayne was not in the service. Did he want to be in the service? Did he want to? Did he during the time of World War II? Did he want to be in the service and fight for his country during that time?
He did, but I think it would be fair to say he was ambivalent. Republic, the studio to which he was under contract at that point when the war broke out, and throughout the war actually. He was under contract to Republic, and Republic kept filing exemptions for him, to which he was entitled, because after Pearl Harbor, FDR basically gave the motion picture industry a pass and said that they could get exemptions for any of their employees they regarded as crucial to the war effort, because FDR thought the movies were far more important for purposes of propaganda than the people who worked in the movie industry would be as soldiers. So, in other words, if you were working in the movie industry and you wanted to go into the army or the service and fight or serve, you had to enlist, because you weren't going to get drafted, because they would file automatic exemptions for you that you could not go around. So you have to just go ahead and enlist. And a lot of guys did enlist. I mean, Clark Gable went in the Air Force. Tyrone Power went in the Marines. Jimmy Stewart went in the Air Force. Henry Fonda was in the Navy. A lot of guys went. Republic filed exemptions for Wayne for 3 years. At some point in early 1943, he applied for the OSS, and he went to Washington to interview with Wild Bill Donovan, who was running the OSS at the time. The reason he wanted to go into the OSS was because John Ford had his own unit called the Field Photo Service that was attached to the OSS. And Ford had this unit, and basically Ford had autonomy. He only had to answer to Donovan. And Wayne wanted to go serve in Ford's unit because, as I said, Ford was his father figure. So he interviewed with Donovan. I found an oral history from one of Donovan's secretaries who confirmed that he was there in the office to interview with Donovan, and that, he'd sat there and filled out the forms and everything. And what happened was Donovan turned him down because he didn't think Wayne had any gifts that were applicable to the OSS, which was the spy operation. It was the precursor to the CIA. And now at that point, Wayne could have simply enlisted in any other branch of the service. He could have gone the Marines, the Army, the Navy, whatever. He did not. He got turned down by Donovan and the OSS. He basically went back to California and kept making movies, and Republic kept filing exemptions for him. And that was how he worked out the war, making movies, basically. So there was a kind of stop-star kind of thing that just went on for 4 years until the war was over.
Now, and then the picture that made him #1, I believe, was the movie Red River with, Montgomery Clift. Howard Hawks directed it. Why do you think that hit so well with audiences and made him a #1 star at that time?
Well, it gave him an identity that was apart and above from other actors. I mean, the part was offered first to Gary Cooper. I mean, every Western part was always offered first to Gary Cooper. John Wayne at this point probably never got a script that didn't have Cooper's fingerprints on it, unless it was a Ford picture. Ford never worked with Cooper; he worked with Wayne. So if Ford offered him a picture, he could be pretty secure that he was the first choice in the picture. He was sure to have been the second choice. Joel McCrea had the same problem. Joel McCrea always got Gary Cooper's cast-offs. Cooper turned down Red River because he simply felt the character was too harsh, which is true. The character is pretty harsh. And Cooper didn't want to play anybody who was that big a prick, basically. But Wayne was willing to do it. Wayne, as I tell people, Wayne would tell screenwriters, you can make me anything you want. Just don't make me small. Don't make me petty. He could play nasty. He could play brutal. He could play crazy. He could play psychotic. That was all fine. What he would not play was someone that could be dismissed. He wasn't going to play somebody nervously sweating out a tenure meeting at a community college in Omaha. That he would not do. He would not play those parts. He was going to play parts that mattered and men that mattered. So he was happy to take on Red River, especially for Hawks, who was a major director that he'd never worked with at that point. And it was a happy shoot for the most part. He got along, as some people who worked on the picture told me, a pain in the ass because he didn't like the method acting thing. But Clift was good, and he admitted Clift was good, and they worked very well together. And it was a happy shoot. He and Hawks hit it off, and they made a batch of pictures in the coming years, Rio Bravo and El Dorado and one or two others.
Yeah, it seemed like Wayne had kind of the same problem that Humphrey Bogart had. I mean, Wayne had the same problem with Gary Cooper that Humphrey Bogart had with George Raft. I don't know if you know that story, but every time...
Yeah, sure. Raft turned down a bunch of stuff at Warner's, like, the Maltese Falcon and things that Bogart ended up getting. And, of course, Bogart became a much bigger star than George Raft was because Raft had such bad taste in scripts.
Yeah,
although Cooper
true.
had pretty good taste in scripts. Cooper had pretty good taste in scripts, in all honesty.
Yeah.
Turning down Red River, may seem, but in hindsight, Cooper made a lot of good movies. It's not like, he was George Raft on a horse.
Well, one of the things that made Wayne kind of big is he did play, he played a hero, but kind of the villain. I don't know if you want to say an anti-hero type, but he was close to the villain at that time, which made him a little bit more real.
He could be ruthless. Yeah, he could play ruthless very well. He could play crazed very well. He could play angry exceedingly well. He could play a lot of qualities that aren't generally seen in heroes in conventional movies. And it worked for him. It jived with his personality. And over time, it gave him a kind of latitude that most movie stars don't have. The audience accepted him in very harsh parts, whether it's Red River or The Searchers.
Yeah. Although he never really played the type of villain that Humphrey Bogart would play, which also I think made Bogart. Okay. All right. But yeah, he never played. he never played the type of villain roles that Humphrey Bogart played, but he did play, like you said, close to the villain. One of his films also, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, he played a man much older than himself. He played a 64 year old. I think was probably his best.
I like that came out. That came out with the same year or within a year of Red River, and I mean that's 180 degrees from the character in Red River. I mean the character Nathan Burrows is his name in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and he's older. He's in his 60s. He's kind of depressed. He's very courtly. He's a soldier who tries to avoid war at all costs. He's utterly unlike the very aggressive, very fierce Tom Dunson in Red River. So in that sense, it was a really kind of a wake-up call to the industry that he could play pretty much anything. He could play tough. He could play gentle, play soft. He had a lot of different arrows in his quiver. And those pictures, as I said, were done within 9 months of each other. So
I was just going to ask real briefly, by the way, and maybe we'll touch on this at the very end before you go. I'd like to get you to give us links to your website and where we can find the book, and maybe you can also talk about how it's doing. I'm hoping it's being. I saw some of the reviews that are outstanding. Obviously, I got the book a couple days ago, and it's very interesting, and I'd like to know how the sales are doing, and hopefully, we can get some insight.
It was so for 4 or 5 weeks last year when it came out in hardcover. And it's doing extremely well in paperback as well. It's been the biggest success of my writing life. It's my 13th book, so that's a considerable writing life.
Congratulations! All right, Mr. Midnight Movie, do you have another question for Mr. Eyman?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that that would. I mean, to me, John Wayne, I mean, he's the quintessential, I guess, would be considered, as far as moviegoers go, kind of the quintessential father figure for the movies. I mean, a lot of people, they either had maybe a Jimmy Stewart father or a John Wayne father.
Right, that's probably true.
No,
it's probably, I would agree with you. The ideal father. I mean, Wayne would probably trend towards the difficult father. Stewart might be a more ideal father emotionally. But I think it's fair to say. I think it's fair to say that John Wayne's probably American ideal in a sense. Kind of a very strong sense of right and wrong, unwilling to compromise on his core beliefs. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Iowa for the opening of the John Wayne Museum in Winterstead, where he was born, and there were people there from all over the world. There was thousands of people. There were people from Australia, France, Germany, I mean, everywhere. And they'd all traveled to America, to this small town. There's 5,000 people in Winterstead, about an hour outside of Des Moines. And they'd all traveled all the way across the world to attend the opening of a museum devoted to John Wayne. Now, you couldn't do that with any other movie star of that era, or of any era, frankly. And I thought, looking out at the crowds, well, this is really a testimonial to, I guess, his continuing hold on the imaginations of certainly the American population and to an extent that of the world.
What kind of father? I mean, what kind of father was John Wayne to his kids?
He was a good father, allowing for the fact that he was a workaholic, because he'd been poor and had spent a lot of years not making much money. When his ship came in, he wanted to capitalize on it, so he worked a lot. He wanted to work a lot. If he sat around the house for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, it was a lot. He would get nervous because he wasn't earning anything. He wasn't a great husband because he was a workaholic, so the wives had to do most of the grunt work of raising the children. They were actually there. He wasn't there an awful lot. He was demanding of the boys. All the kids were sent to Catholic school. Everybody had to go to college. All the kids had to go to college. That was mandatory. He expected A's. If you didn't get A's, he wanted to know why. He was demanding. And, because he was John Wayne, the kids, lived in mortal terror of doing things that John Wayne's kids shouldn't do. So they were constantly having to kind of watch themselves out of the corner of their eye to make sure they didn't get caught doing something that John Wayne's kid would embarrass John Wayne, And I know several of the kids. I knew Michael very well. I know Aisa, his second youngest daughter. I know Marissa, his youngest daughter. And they're very. I know Patrick. I don't know him well. I've met him. I've interviewed him a couple times. And he was a great grandfather. I talked to several of his grandchildren. As one described him, he was a throw you up in the air and catch you kind of grandfather. He was, because by that time he was older and more relaxed, and he was around more. For the grandchildren, even though there were dozens of them. He had 7 kids, so at a certain point there were over 20, 25 grandchildren. He had trouble keeping their names straight. But he was still a lot of fun. He was still a lot of fun with them when they were around the house at holidays.
Now, getting to his relationship with John Ford. John Ford, there were people that didn't like John Ford, and that John Ford could be really contentious, and but John Wayne stuck by him regardless.
Yeah, well, to Wayne, as I said, he was a father figure, and he felt he owed Ford his career. That without Ford, he wouldn't have had the career he had. He wouldn't have had the money that he earned. He wouldn't have had the lifestyle that he earned. And Ford was an extremely difficult man. He was dark. He was bleak. He was sardonic. He was demanding. He was the sort of Wayne called him Coach or Pappy, one or the other. And Coach sums it up, but he was the kind of coach that was not the sort to throw his arms around you when you did something really difficult. You'd get a grunt and maybe a nod. That's all you're going to get out of Ford for pulling off a great scene. He wasn't effusive. Quite the contrary. And Wayne didn't mind that, but Ford could also be abusive, and Wayne pretended not to mind that. It irritated a lot of other people because Ford would call him things like a dumb cluck and make fun of him because he hadn't been in the service during the war. Ford, of course, emerged a commander in the Navy, and kept reminding Wayne of that fact. And people thought it was a very strange relationship because Ford was constantly putting people on the defensive, none more so than Wayne. But Wayne took it and smiled and said he doesn't mean it. It doesn't mean anything. Don't worry about it. And would just let it roll off his back. But a lot of people thought it was a very strange relationship, but Wayne didn't.
With the movie The Searchers, I heard it was John Ford's idea to make him the ant. Is that true?
To make him the what? I didn't catch that word.
I'm sorry.
To make him what?
To make him the anti. It was John Ford's idea in The Searchers to make him the anti-Indian racist that he was. That he was in the film.
Right. Right. The characters. There's all sorts of changes from the source material, which was a novel by a man named Alan LeMay. The character's harsher in the book than he is in the novel. And Ford deepened the relationships. The idea that Ford was in love with his sister-in-law, which is communicated strictly inferentially. There's no dialogue to indicate it. It's just done with looks and by inference. That's not in the book. The virulent racism is not in the book. Yeah, Ford did all sorts of things to make the movie cut a little closer to the bone. It's a good book, but it's a great movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the book is not as good as the movie. The Godfather being one of them. I'd get into that in another time. But now I heard that John Ford said to God, I forget his name. He was now I can't even remember. Who's Natalie Wood's husband?
Robert Wagner.
I know you want the part in The Searchers, but I'm not going to give it to you. Is that true? Right.
Yeah, that's a true story. Robert Wagner told me that. That's absolutely true. Yeah. You're not going to play the part. Jeff Hunter's going to play the part. Ford could be cruel. Ford could be very cruel.
Now, why did he do that? I mean, what reason would he have to do something like that?
Well, he never explained it. My belief is that it was a way to keep other people on the defensive, so that he would always have the upper hand psychologically and practically. That he would always be in control. Control was obviously for a director is extremely important, and there are various ways you can get control. The way Ford got control was by keeping everybody else in a submissive posture and keeping them off balance and keeping them in a defensive position.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I guess there were a lot of actors that didn't like that. And I've heard some actors said that they worked on a film with Ford and would never work with him, or at least said they would never work with him again.
Well, there were a few actors like that. Walter Brennan, did My Darling Clementine. Walter Brennan was a splendid actor, 3 Academy Awards and all that. And I mean, he absolutely refused to ever work for Ford again after My Darling Clementine, even though he's great in the movie. A lot of people put up with it. As Maureen O'Hara told me, as rough as he was, I'm paraphrasing here, this is at the end of the book, as rough as he was, as difficult as he was, you took it and you worked with him because you had the chance of making something great with John Ford. And how many directors could you say that about? There were plenty of nice guy directors who never made a good movie, let alone a great movie. With Ford, you had the chance of making a great movie. So aside from the fact, that you were getting paid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there was also, you could take real pride in the caliber of the work you were doing and in the people you were associating with. And I think that was a contributing factor to why so many people were willing to put up with him, because he was a genius and he was an artist.
Yeah, that is true. And then we'll talk about, which is a film that practically almost, I would say, bankrupted John Wayne, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, The Alamo. The Alamo.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. He put basically all of his own money into it. He was desperate to make the picture. He had a deal with UA, but the money the UA gave him to make the picture was nowhere near enough to make the movie he wanted to make. There was just no way. He wanted to make an epic adventure to end all adventures. And they were giving him, I don't remember on the book open in front of me, it's $4 or $5 million, not a lot. And he needed double that, triple that. So he found independent investors. He put his own money into it. And the way the deal was structured, everybody got their money. UA got their money. The independent investors got their money. Wayne was in last position for recoupment of his investment. So the picture did okay, but it didn't do enough to pay off everybody. UA did fine. The investors got their money back. John Wayne never got his money back. So after the film came out, basically he had to start working real fast to rebuild his bank account, because he mortgaged his film library, the pictures he'd produced previously to that, like Hondo and High and the Mighty. He'd mortgaged those to the bank. He'd used all of his available cash, so he had to start churning out pictures really quickly to build up his bank account again.
Now, what year was he diagnosed with cancer for the first time?
1964. The end of 1963.
And how was his because he looked, you could never tell that he only had one lung. In any of his, even in the shootist, you couldn't tell that he was frail or anything like that. He didn't come off that way. Well,
he didn't come off that way, but if you listen to his voice, it's very raspy. Those last couple of pictures he made, his voice is raspy. He's having a lot of bronchial trouble. After he lost basically a lung to cancer. He was a heavy smoker. He smoked 4 or 5 packs a day of unfiltered, I believe they were Lucky Strikes, or Camels. No, it was Camels. He smoked Camels, unfiltered, and it was just lit one off the butt of the other. He was a nonstop smoker. So when he had the lung removed, he had, after that point, whenever he got a cold, it was 50-50 to turn into a serious bronchial problem. And whenever he would shoot at elevations, make a movie at elevations, Sons of Katie Elder was the first movie he made after the cancer surgery. I think it's at like 5,000 feet. He had to have oxygen there because his breathing was affected. He covered it, and he played indomitable, but he was not indomitable, and he had a lot of bronchial and a lot of lung problems for the rest of his life because he was only having one lung, and his wind was never good. It affected his ability to do a lot of fight scenes. A lot of his writing in the later pictures is doubled. And if you watch, when it's him, you can see he's often holding onto the pommel of the saddle, which he never did before that. He never did before the cancer surgery. On some level, it made him a little less sure of himself in the saddle. And real horsemen just go crazy when they see that. I was in Winterset, Barry Corbin, the character actor, was there. And Barry Corbin's a serious horse guy, cutting horse guy. And he was just rolling his eyes at Wayne holding on the pommel of the saddle, which is the mark of an amateur horseman. And Wayne was not an amateur horseman. He could ride a horse. But he didn't ride a horse anywhere near as well after his cancer surgery as he had before his cancer surgery.
Did he still smoke?
Yes, he never stopped smoking. When I met him in that dressing room at CBS, he was smoking little black cigars. Sometimes he'd chew tobacco. Other times he'd, but he always had to have some kind of tobacco going. What he meant when he said he quit, he stopped smoking cigarettes to a great extent. But he would do other things. He'd smoke cigars. He'd chew tobacco. He had to have the nicotine. He couldn't not have the nicotine. He was totally addicted.
Yeah, there are some people, that are absolutely addicted, and no matter what you do, they just can't.
Absolutely, they cannot stop.
Quit.
They can't quit. No, absolutely.
I don't know if it's in your book, but I remember my dad. For his film festival, he honored Bud Schulberg, and Bud Schulberg talked about John Wayne, and they almost came to fisticuffs in Mexico. Did you know much about that?
Over what?
Over politics. Over politics, and Bud Schulberg, I guess, didn't like him because of that, and he said he kind of wouldn't let it go. Bud Schulberg said he was convinced that he was a communist.
But who was a communist?
John Wayne was convinced that Bud Schulberg was a communist.
Well, Bud Schulberg named names in the American Activities Committee. He named people in the Communist Party in the American Activities Committee. Schulberg always considered himself a liberal, as did Elia Kazan. They always considered themselves liberals. No getting around that. Like I mentioned at the beginning, he was the most famous conservative in Hollywood in that era. And he was president of the Motion Picture Alliance from 1950 for several terms, several two-year terms. And the Alliance was the predominant conservative organization in Hollywood that was pushing for the blacklisting of communists or communist sympathizers in the industry. So he was a very conservative guy, no question. So Schulberg's story might very well be correct. I didn't know they knew each other, and I didn't know that they hooked up on some level in Mexico. Mexico was Wayne's favorite country. He loved Mexico, loved tequila. He loved Latin women. He loved everything about Mexico. So it's quite possible they hooked up down there.
And
related, go ahead.
Just real quick, related to that was a story I found interesting that was in the book was John Wayne's affiliation with the John Birch Society and the falling out that he had. Could you talk about that for a quick second?
Yeah, well, the Birch Society, of course, was the most conservative, was the most right-wing of the right-wing organizations in the 1950s and 60s. And evidently they had a small but potent contingent of Hollywood people like Adolph Maggio, who was also extremely conservative. And evidently Wayne was a member at one time, but he dropped out because the head of the John Birch Society was a lunatic named Robert Welch. And Robert Welch was convinced that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent. and Eisenhower was, Wayne would have preferred Douglas MacArthur be elected president instead of Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, but MacArthur didn't really run. But he did know Eisenhower. He certainly, and John Ford, of course, had worked with Eisenhower during the war and knew him very well. And Wayne knew that any talk of Eisenhower being a communist agent was no. At that point, he realized that maybe the John Birch Society was not for him.
Now, how did he get along with Ed Asner in El Dorado?
In El Dorado? I don't know. I didn't talk to Asner for the book. I'm sure, assuming Asner's politics were as liberal at the time in the mid-'60s as later when he was running the Screen Actors Guild, I can't imagine they would have gotten along at all had politics come up in the discussion. Although Wayne was not one of those people who had to agree with you politically to like you. There were a number of liberal people that, he was very friendly with and he played chess with all the time. And he knew they were liberal and they knew he was conservative. and they would, josh each other about it. So it depends really on whether he liked Asner as an actor and whether Asner had a sense of humor. If Asner was a good drinking man, had a good sense of humor, and could play chess, Wayne wouldn't have cared what his politics were.
So Wayne was a chess player. I did not.
Oh yeah, a crazy chess player. He was a devoted chess player. He was, I would classify him as slightly below tournament caliber, but not much. Played chess with him. Basically, that was a prerequisite to working in a John Wayne film. You had to be able to give him a good game of chess because that's how he passed the time. And there's always time between shots while they're lighting the set and this thing and that thing. It's, there's a lot of waiting around on a film set. And Wayne wouldn't sit there. He wanted to be active, and his activity was playing chess because he was always note perfect with his scripts, his lines. He came on the set, he knew, or he was cold on his lines. So he was there to work. But when he wasn't working, he was going to play chess. So there had to be 3 or 4 guys on the set who could give him a game. And I talked to a number of guys who played chess with him, Ron Howard among them on The Shootist. And Howard said he was just brutal because he was so aggressive. He'd go right at your queen, right up front. And he was extremely aggressive player, and he didn't mess around. He was there to obliterate you. He wasn't there to, draw the game out for 2 hours. He was there to take you out as quickly as possible.
Now, I also heard that he took calculus in college as well.
He was very smart. His correspondence, there's a lot of correspondence in the book of his business correspondence. I don't know if he took calculus. He was in pre-law. He was on a football scholarship at USC at the college because he got a football scholarship because he was all state at Glendale High. He was a lineman, and he was in pre-law. That was his area of study. I don't know if he was taking calculus. I suspect he was, getting a lot of his 101 level courses out of the way. He was there 2 years at USC, and then he messed up his shoulder surfing in a surfing accident, and he couldn't block because his shoulder was separated, and he was in agony if he tried to block. So the coach cut him from the team, and at that point he had to drop out of USC because, as I said, he had no money. So he'd already been working a summer job at Fox, doing props and lugging stuff around. So he simply downshifted and went to work full-time at Fox at that point after he lost his football scholarship. So I don't know if he was taking calculus, but he had I believe he had a 92 or 93 average in high school. So, and as I said, he was president of the senior class, so he was not a slug by any means when it came to the books.
Well, I'll tell you, if you read his Playboy interview, besides the I guess the controversial things he said about blacks, it was a very thoughtful, and it was a very in depth and very just someone who was a kind of a deep thinker, and he thought both sides of the aisle. He was able to articulate liberal and conservative views fairly well.
Oh yeah. No. And I started to say his business correspondence is very incisive, and it's not bullet points. That's a modern thing, but it could be bullet points. He's very articulate. He's very incisive. It's like here's Exhibit A, here's Exhibit B, here's Exhibit C, here's the decision we need to come to. Get back to me as quickly as possible because this is what I think and this is why I think it. And sincerely yours. He doesn't mess around. He's very articulate, and as I said, it's almost bullet point style.
Yeah, and now John Wayne, the Green Berets, made him rather. Did that film make a profit?
Yes, it was profitable. Eventually it was extremely profitable. It made a little money at the time, but over the years it's made a great deal of money.
Now that film I heard made him rather unpopular until he did True Grit.
True.
With the younger crowd.
It made him, also it kind of cost him any chance. I mean, he was at this point, he's 60 years old anyway. 62. He's 62, 61 or 62 years old. And I mean, 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds are rarely interested in movie stars who are 60 years old. There's a generational thing that falls off the older a movie star gets. And the fact that it was a pro-Vietnam picture in 1968, at a time when the country was 21 one making a pro-Vietnam picture. All the other pictures were anti-Vietnam pictures. Basically, I think alienated half the audience, half the movie audience from him, you know, and you still get that to this day. You still get to this day. I you know, on my book tours and appearances, I would run into, you know, a lot of 60 and 65-year-old people, basically like my age, who had no use for him, based strictly on his stance during the Vietnam War. Not on his acting, you know, strictly on his stance during the Vietnam War, and the success of True Grit, which was a huge hit in the Academy Award, and the kind of farewell movies he made after that didn't make the least bit of difference to him. The Vietnam thing had been the death knell of any interest an entire generation had in John Wayne. So in that sense, it was a destructive decision to make, but he didn't care. He believed in the war. He thought it was necessary to support the soldiers. He might have gotten away with it if it had been a better movie, but it wasn't a very good movie. But he didn't care. He made the film he wanted to make. He directed it himself. He never evinced the least regrets about making it.
And then he made True Grit that gave him the Oscar, and
a couple of years later, yeah.
And it kind of changed him with some of the audience. More people came to accept him. He kind of perhaps won over some of the people.
Well, it reminded people of why they liked him in the first place, and it also was a transitional film for him, in that he made the transition from playing like a father figure to a grandfather figure. You know, Rooster Cogburns old. He drinks too much. He's got a gut on him. He falls off the horse. You know, he's in a sense he's comic relief. But when it's time to suck it up, does, you know, he brings back the girl, just like John Wayne had brought back the girl in The Searchers. He finds the girl, he brings her back. Nobody else could do it. So in a sense he's combining elements of The Searchers with comic elements that are sort of a self-satire of the John Wayne character.
Now, and then he does the Playboy interview a few years afterwards. Now, what was the public's reaction?
Well, by that time, again, this is after the Green Berets, so everybody knows he's right-wing. So, you know, he was the odd thing about him is that, as he explained it to me, I hate blanking politics, and I hate blanking politicians. And he meant it. He really disliked them. That said, he could never not answer a straight question. If you asked him a question, he'd tell you what he thought, even if what he thought was, you know, not particularly based in anything except Edwardian prejudice. So, you know, in the Playboy interview, he talks about that white people should colonize Africa, that there were vast portions of Africa that weren't being used, so white people should go over there and colonize it. You know, well, you know, what can you say to that? There was some really breathtaking imperialist sentiments expressed. But by that time, everybody kind of don't think there was quite the stuff like that for years. This wasn't the only time. He'd given an interview like that in Life magazine, saying some of the same things a couple of years earlier. But for some reason, it hadn't caused it didn't reach an audience like the Playboy interview did. So in that sense, it was more of the same from the guy that made the Green Berets. But as I said, he was not a person who tried to tailor his opinions to his audience. You asked him a question, he'd tell you what he thought.
Now, I wanted to get into the movie, The Cowboys, which was, and I think you may agree with me, that was his most progressive film.
Aggressive how?
Progressive, like the way it portrayed Nightlinger, played by Roscoe Lee James. And I heard that Mark Rydell did not want him for the film.
No, Mark Rydell wanted George C. No, I believe George C. Scott was Mark Rydell's first choice. But Warner Brothers wanted John Wayne. It was an expensive picture. It was going to cost a lot more than a conventional John Wayne picture. So they thought they needed, and George C. Scott didn't have any a commercial track record, certainly not a Western. So they wanted John Wayne. So, Wayne set out to win over to make the picture with him.
And I heard that Mark Rydell deliberately put cast people in that were not his usual type of people. His wife had been a former blacklisted actress.
That's true. That's all true. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, if you look at the film, I mean, Roscoe Lee James is
Roscoe Lee Brown.
Roscoe Lee Brown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Roscoe Lee Brown, the guy who played Nightlinger, is his equal in that film in every way. And
sure.
he even confronts him on things. And like I said, it's quite a different film. And I think it's the only film, and I could be absolutely wrong, the only film that he was the first Western that he was killed in. The second one was The Shootist, but it was
the first Western he was killed in. Might be the first Western. He got killed in a couple. He got killed in the Sands of Iwo Jima. He got killed in The Wild Wind. He might have been the first Western he was killed in.
Yeah, the first Western that he was killed in, and the way in which he was killed, and where he gets avenged too, and very unique picture, and actually my personal favorite film that he did in the 70s.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's a good movie. I don't think it's a great movie, but I think it's a good movie.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's a very good. Now and it was the first PG film, from what I understand as well.
Really, it's pretty violent. The fight seems pretty violent.
Yeah, no, but all films were rated. All films before that were G, R, and X. And then when that film came out, it was
something between G and R.
Yeah, and then they said, they're going to put because it was so violent, they rated it PG. Actually. So that was the first PG film, and like I said, it was in Bruce Dern is the villain, and like I said, I found it to be a very progressive and very interesting film.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a good film.
Yeah, and then we get to The Shootist, his last film, and any inquiries on that? Because I heard that was to go.
Well, that's sort of his valedictory. It's as much about John Wayne as it is about the character. He picked up a lung infection when they were shooting the locations in Carson City. They got back to Hollywood, and he got sicker and sicker, and they had to close the picture down for 2 weeks. And nobody was really sure if he was coming back because he was really sick, and he'd never lost production time before. I mean, he was a horse. He'd work hungover. He'd work in terrible pain. He'd work with his back was out. He worked, but this was the first trouble physically. And they shut the picture down for 2 weeks. It was very dicey as to whether he was going to come back. And they shot a version of the ending, the gunfight at the ending, without him. They shot it with doubles because if he wasn't going to come back, they were going to have to do something to get the picture made. And they hadn't shot the final gunfight. But he did get better. He did come back. He finished the picture. But his health was very shaky on The Shootist, even though it doesn't seem like it's shaky. It was sometimes it was a very narrow escape getting that picture made. And I think it's a very good picture. I think Don Siegel did an excellent job. And God knows it's a better way to go out than Brannigan would have been, or Rooster Cogburn, the sequel to True Grit. Neither of those pictures is very good or even worthy of him. The Shootist is worthy of him and worthy of that career and what the career stands for.
Yeah. I mean, he almost did a film with Peter Bogdanovich, but he turned it down, unfortunately, which I think would have been I think would have been a great film, and probably would have been. It might
very well have been a great film, but he didn't want to do it. He was adamant that he obviously didn't like the script, because Jimmy Stewart was going to do it, and Henry Fonda was willing to do it, but they needed commercially they needed Wayne to sign on the picture, and he just turned it down a bunch of times. He wouldn't do it, and there it went. So Larry McMurtry rewrote it as Lonesome Dove. Rewrote the script as Lonesome Dove.
And then his last appearance at the Oscars, which I heard that he wore a wetsuit.
That's not true. That's not true. He was very ill with cancer. He died 2 months later. He was obviously dying. He'd lost a great amount of weight. He had to have a new tux made for him. You know, his old tux hung on him, special tux made, but he didn't wear a wetsuit. No, he'd probably lost a good 50 pounds at that point, and it looks like he'd lost 50 pounds at that point. He's about as skinny as he'd been since the big trail, and he doesn't look good. You know, he's got death all over him. You can see it in his face. But he was dying, but he promised to be there and award the Best Picture Oscar. And even though he was getting daily radiation treatments and was obviously dying, he showed up to do the show, you know, because he promised. That was what John Wayne did. He made a promise, he kept it.
Now, did Wayne, like, after that time, like during the time he was dying, did he have any picture, like was he planning on doing any pictures? Was he planning?
Yeah, he had a picture. He wanted to make called Bo John, about a horse trainer and his grandson, and he wanted Ron Howard to do it for him. We do it with him because he really liked Ron Howard. He'd enjoyed working with him on The Shootist. And Howard told me that he never saw a script, that they never got to the script stage, that Wayne had bought the novel, and there were some treatments floating around, but Howard never actually saw anything. It never got to the script stage. And when Wayne had talked to him about it, Wayne was already looking pretty bad. He was already ill. So Howard figured this was very dicey. So it was a light at the end of the tunnel that Wayne was working toward, but it really wasn't firmed up in any meaningful way.
Now, had Ron Howard met John Wayne before The Shootist?
No.
But they had a really good relationship.
Oh yeah, Howard's fascinating. It was one of the most fascinating interviews I had doing the book. The way, because Wayne loved to rehearse, and Wayne and the director Don Siegel weren't speaking. They didn't like each other at all. But Wayne liked Howard, and Siegel liked Howard. So Howard was the go-between between Wayne and the director, because they both liked him. So he could see what Wayne was thinking and why, and he could see what Siegel was thinking and why. And it was a great object lesson to him in terms of getting a film made, you know, because even though Wayne and the director couldn't stand each other, they never really lost any time over it. They lost time when Wayne got sick. But they were both professionals. They got the picture made in spite of the fact they couldn't stand each other. And also it was interesting to work with Wayne on scenes, to rehearse with Wayne. And Wayne loved to rehearse, and Howard loved to rehearse. So it was a relationship of equals, really.
Yeah, and Wayne and Lauren Bacall also got along.
She'd worked with him before in the 50s on a lousy picture called Blood Alley, and she was extremely liberal, as was her husband, Bogart. And she was prepared to dislike him and was shocked to really like him, you know. She just I talked to Bacall a couple times about Wayne in the writing of the book, and she had nothing but fond memories and a great deal of respect for him.
And I also
as a man and as an actor.
Yeah. I also heard that Katharine Hepburn also liked John Wayne as well. And she was very
I think she had a crush on him, actually. There's some corresponding couple letters that are a little short of MASH notes, really.
Now, she wanted him to do the play, The Gin Game, I heard.
No, not true. Not true.
Okay. I guess I heard wrong through the grapevine. Well, that's all the questions I have. JP, do you have any questions for Don Imus?
It's not Don Imus. It's
Scott
Eyman.
Jeez.
Scott.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Where can people find more? Your books and your current great book, John Wayne: The Life and Legend. Where can we get this?
Well, it's at Barnes and Noble. It's on Amazon. It's on all the usual spots. And as I said, it's been extremely successful. And I'm very glad that it's reached such a large and appreciative public.
So are we.
Well, yeah, and this book really does take from all, as the one reviewer said, it takes from all angles of his life, and it's quite unique. And it's something that hasn't, the life of John Wayne, that hasn't quite been revealed. Yeah, I hope.
Well, that was my object. That was my object. I didn't like any of the books that had been written about him. Most of them were trash. One or two were serious attempts. I didn't see the point in writing another book on John Wayne if I couldn't exceed what had already been done. So my goal is to have something new on every page.
Great.
Oh, it certainly was. It was certainly, yeah. I mean,
and this will be going to Mr. Midnight Movie's father, Ross Hawkins. He will get this copy of John Wayne, the Life and the Legend. Thank you so much for going even a little overtime with us. I really appreciate that, and we'll definitely spread the word the best we can about your book.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Take care of yourself.
You too. Thank you.
Oh, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.